The sound of the front door closing echoed through the house, a hollow thud that seemed to linger in the air long after the latch clicked into place. Mum was gone, off to visit her sister for a couple of days, leaving Dad and me alone in the quiet house. I was used to these little separations. They happened often enough. But this time, the silence felt heavier, more oppressive, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. I sat on the couch, flipping through TV channels without really seeing them. The house was too still, the kind of stillness that makes you hyper-aware of every creak and sigh of the floorboards. Dad was in the kitchen, the faint clink of a spoon against a mug breaking the silence now and then. The sound was familiar, comforting in its mundanity, but tonight it felt like a prelude to something I couldn't name. "Do you want anything?" Dad called out, his voice calm but carrying a faint edge, a note of something I couldn't quite place. "No, I'm good," I replied, trying to sound casual, though my chest felt tight. A few moments later, he walked into the living room, coffee in hand, and sat on the opposite end of the couch. We sat in silence for a while, the hum of the TV filling the space between us. I could feel his eyes on me, glancing over every so often, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how to start. "You okay?" I asked, breaking the silence. Dad turned to look at me, his expression unreadable. "Yeah," he said slowly, his voice low. "Just thinking." "About what?" I pressed, curiosity getting the better of me. He sighed and placed his coffee mug on the table. "I don't know. It's just strange, having the house this quiet. Your mum's usually the one who keeps things lively." I nodded, understanding what he meant. The house did feel different without her here. She had a way of filling the space with warmth, with life. Without her, the air felt colder, the silence more pronounced. It was as if her absence had left a void, and neither of us knew how to fill it. As the night wore on, our conversation deepened. We talked about things we usually never discussed. Dad's feelings about his job, the things he wished he had done when he was younger. It felt strange, almost too personal, like we were crossing an invisible line. But neither of us stopped. It was as if we were both drawn into the conversation, unable to pull back. At some point, Dad shifted closer on the couch, his knee brushing against mine. It wasn't intentional, I told myself. Just a natural movement. But I could feel my heart rate quicken. The closeness made me suddenly aware of the tension that had been hanging in the air all night. "I've always been proud of you," Dad said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "You've grown into such an amazing person." I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. There was something in his tone that felt off, something that made my skin prickle. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, but the longer I stayed in that moment, the more confusing it became. The tension between us grew, thick and suffocating, like a weight pressing down on my chest. Dad leaned back on the couch, his arm casually draped over the backrest, but his eyes never left mine. It felt too intense, too personal. I shifted uncomfortably in my seat, trying to shake the feeling, but it lingered, settling in the quiet of the room. "I should probably get to bed," I said abruptly, standing up. I needed to escape, to clear my head. Dad didn't move. He just watched me, his expression unreadable. "Yeah, it's late," he agreed, though his voice carried a lingering tone, as if he wasn't ready for the night to end. I walked to my room, my heart pounding, the sound of my footsteps echoing down the hallway. Once inside, I closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, trying to steady myself. My mind was racing, replaying every moment of the evening. Was I overthinking things? Was it just me, or was there something unspoken between us? I couldn't be sure. I changed into my pajamas, trying to push away the strange vibe, telling myself I was just imagining things. It was probably the quiet of the house getting to me. But when I climbed into bed, sleep wouldn't come. My thoughts refused to quiet, and the tension I'd felt earlier seemed to grow even stronger in the solitude of my room. A light knock on the door broke the silence, and my heart skipped a beat when I heard Dad's voice from the other side. "Are you still awake?" I hesitated before answering. "Yeah." The door opened slightly, and Dad stepped inside, the soft glow from the hallway casting long shadows on the walls. He was holding a glass of water, perhaps an excuse to come in. He stood by the doorway for a moment, hesitating, before walking over to my bedside. "I brought you some water," he said, placing the glass on the nightstand. His voice was calm, but his presence felt overwhelming in the small space. "Thanks," I murmured, pulling the blankets up a little higher to create some distance between us. He sat on the edge of the bed, his weight causing the mattress to dip slightly. "You seemed distant earlier," he said softly, his gaze fixed on me. I shook my head, trying to brush it off. "I'm fine. Just tired, I guess." Dad looked at me for a long moment, his eyes searching mine as if he was trying to figure something out. Then, without warning, he reached out and placed a hand on my shoulder. The gesture wasn't harsh or improper, but it seemed overly personal for the moment, too full of significance. "I just want you to know," he said softly, "that you can always talk to me about anything." I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. There was something about the way he looked at me that made me feel like I was standing on the brink of something dangerous, something I wasn't ready to face. "I know," I whispered, my voice barely above a murmur. Dad's hand stayed on my shoulder for a moment longer before he stood up. "Get some rest," he said in a soft tone. He walked to the door but stopped and glanced back at me, his eyes full of something I couldn't quite understand. Then he was gone, leaving me alone with the weight of everything that had just transpired between us. The following morning, I woke up with a sense of unease that lingered from the previous night. The house was silent. Too silent. I quickly got dressed, my mind replaying Dad's visit from last night. It didn't feel right, but I couldn't tell if I was just imagining something that wasn't there. When I entered the kitchen, Dad was already there, leaning against the counter with a cup of coffee in hand. He greeted me with a casual smile, but I could still feel the tension between us. "Morning," he said, his tone light, as though nothing unusual had happened. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound casual, though my mind was racing. I poured myself some tea, avoiding eye contact, hoping the awkwardness would fade. The silence between us stretched as we both went through the motions of breakfast. I could sense him looking at me occasionally, but I focused on my cup, hoping to get through the meal without addressing the night before. "I was thinking," Dad began, breaking the silence. "Maybe we could spend some time together today, just the two of us." There it was again, the weight in his voice, something more than a simple fatherly suggestion. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. The idea of spending the day alone with Dad, after everything I was feeling, seemed like a bad idea, but I didn't want to make things more uncomfortable by turning him down. "Sure," I said, forcing a smile. "What do you have in mind?" "I thought we could take a drive, maybe head to the lake. We haven't been there in a while." The lake. It had once been one of our favorite spots when I was younger, but now the thought of being alone with him there, away from the house and away from any distractions, made me nervous. "Yeah, okay," I finally said. "That sounds nice." Dad seemed pleased with my answer, and soon we were on our way. Driving through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, the ride was mostly silent, with only the occasional comment about the weather or scenery to fill the gaps. Yet, the underlying tension remained. When we arrived at the lake, the familiar sight of the shimmering water in the sunlight brought back memories of simpler times. Dad parked the car, and we walked down to the shore, the sound of the water gently lapping against the rocks filling the quiet between us. "It's peaceful here, isn't it?" Dad said, standing next to me, his eyes fixed on the water. "Yeah," I agreed, though I felt anything but peaceful. We sat down on the rocks, close enough that our shoulders touched. The contact made my skin prickle, and I shifted slightly to create some space. But Dad didn't seem to notice. He was too busy staring at the lake, lost in thought. "I miss this," he said softly. "Spending time with you. Just us." His words hit me unexpectedly. There was a sadness to them, a longing that felt deeper than just a father missing time with his daughter. I didn't know how to respond. "I miss it too," I finally said, though I wasn't sure if I really meant it. Everything felt so complicated now, so full of meaning that I didn't want to confront. Dad turned to look at me, his eyes searching mine as they had the night before. "I feel like we've grown apart," he said quietly. "And I don't want that. I don't want to lose you." My heart started to race, the words hanging between us, too heavy, too intimate. I knew that this conversation was veering into territory I wasn't comfortable with, but I was unsure how to stop it. "I'm not leaving," I murmured, trying to ease the tension, attempting to pull us back from the edge. "We're just busy, you know? Life happens." Dad nodded, but the intensity in his eyes remained unchanged. "I understand, but it feels like more than that. Like you've been slipping away from me." I didn't know how to respond, though part of me recognized the truth in his words. Something had shifted between us, but I couldn't pinpoint when or how. This moment, standing by the lake, felt like it could alter everything, just not in a way I desired. "We're fine," I quickly reassured him, eager to end the conversation before it went further. "Really, we are." Dad reached out and took my hand. His grip was steady, yet gentle. A simple gesture that should have been comforting, but instead it sent a chill through me. His touch lingered just a bit too long, and I found myself holding my breath. "You're important to me," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "More than you know." I pulled my hand back, striving to hold on to some sense of normalcy, even though everything felt anything but normal. My heart was pounding, and I could feel his gaze on me, waiting, expectant, as if he was waiting for me to give him something more. But I couldn't offer that. I couldn't cross that line, even if he already had. "I think we should head back," I said abruptly, standing up. I couldn't stay there any longer, couldn't let that moment stretch out. The air between us felt thick, charged with something neither of us had the courage to name. Dad stood as well, his expression unreadable. For a second, it seemed like he might say something more, something that would bring us even closer to the edge. But instead, he simply nodded. "Yeah, okay." The ride back was quiet, the tension between us more palpable than ever. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, trying to ignore the slight tremble in my hands resting on my lap. Dad didn't speak either, though I felt his gaze flickering toward me from time to time. When we finally arrived home, I almost ran out of the car. Desperate for the space to breathe, I hurried inside, my heart still racing, and went straight to my room, closing the door behind me. I stood there for a while, trying to gather my thoughts, to make sense of everything that had happened. It felt as if we had been circling something dangerous all day, and I wasn't sure what it meant. Was it just me? Or was he feeling it too? And what did this mean for us moving forward? A knock at the door startled me out of my thoughts. "Can I come in?" Dad's voice was calm, but that same undertone I'd been trying to ignore was still there. I hesitated. Part of me wanted to say no to create that barrier, but another part of me, the part that was lost in confusion, wanted to talk it through to find some resolution. After a long pause, I opened the door just enough for him to step inside. He didn't speak at first, simply stood there watching me. The silence between us felt heavy, filled with all the things we hadn't said. "I'm sorry," he said at last, his voice soft, laced with regret. "I didn't mean to make things awkward." I nodded, unable to trust myself to speak. The air was a strange mixture of relief and tension, and I wasn't sure how to handle it. "I think we both need some space," I said quietly. This is too much." Dad's expression softened, and he nodded in agreement. "You're right," he replied. "Maybe I crossed a line." I didn't respond. The things he had said, the way he had acted, it all felt irreversible, like something we couldn't take back, something that had left a mark on our relationship. We stood there for a moment longer, the weight of everything still hanging between us, before he turned and left, leaving me alone with my thoughts.